Now available in paperback and e-readers, The Legendary Mad Matilda. Get the conclusion to the Spinsterella trilogy at online booksellers today. I was thinking critically about what we're calling SJW comic book creators, and as I take a more critical look at them from an anthropological perspective, I'm beginning to believe that they are disturbingly a sign of our times, because when it comes down to comic books are a reflection of a period in time, and they are a commentary on that period in time. And when it comes down to these SJW comic books, I'm beginning to think that they are a commentary on how far our culture has fallen. Because in the original days of the American comic book was created during a time when we had a strong family. Now, during the time when comic books were created in the late 1930s and early 1940s, we had a lot of two-parent households, and we had fathers in the home. However, in this age of 2000s, the 2010s, we've had a complete change in the American family. And I've had family members who worked in education, and they see the complete change in the American family. And that's what I'm seeing reflected in a lot of what we're calling these SJW comic books, is we're seeing a complete change in the American family. Because one of my family members who works with young toddlers who are 3 and 4 years old is seeing a lot of behavior I notice in books like your Squirrel Girls, your Ms. Marvels, and many of your other SJW books like your Unstoppable Wasps. Now, when you look at those SJW Marvel books, you see people who are just sitting around doing nothing all day and not taking on the bad guys, or they just take on minimal challenges. And that's reflective of what these kids saw during their time in places like a daycare center. And a lot of kids who grew up in with this as their original base for their culture, this is what they learned as culture. They're learning that you just sit in this type of environment and you really don't interact with the world or have experiences with the world. And as these people grew up, this is what we're seeing reflected in the comic books, because the comic books are reflecting their view of the world. And their view of the world is extremely limited because they never really had any sort of real life experience or real richness of experience. So when I take a look at these SJW comic books, as they're called, I'm seeing a commentary on how really privileged many people are in America and how they've never really experienced life. Now, the original creators of comic books, these were people who grew up and they had hard experiences, they had hard times, and they wanted to make a commentary on the world about them. And superheroes were their commentary on how they wanted to improve the quality of life for themselves and how they wanted to serve the community and make life better for others. The role of the superhero was they were somebody like a community volunteer. They wanted to help people like law enforcement. They wanted to help people have a better quality of life. They wanted to make life safer for other people. And the great irony is that from the superhero, we've gotten the SJW, and the SJW, because they have such a privileged and advantaged life, they don't understand what was sacrificed to get them to this point. So these SJW creators, they don't understand what a superhero is. They don't understand things are, because they grew up in an extremely sheltered life, extremely sheltered world, and they don't have any sort of life experience. So these kids, they grew up to become adults in a world of privilege, in a world of advantages, and they don't understand things like conflict. They don't understand things like overcoming obstacles, because everybody does things for them. If we look at them as they grow up further, because I have other family members who work in education, and in that educational environment, there's always somebody patting them on the back, somebody always affirming them. And we're seeing that reflected in the comics, like we saw in Ms. Marvel, like we see with Riri Williams, we're seeing these type of characters who don't have any sort of self-esteem or self-confidence, and they're always validating themselves because people are always telling them that they're good. And that's all part of our culture that was been passed on in the 2000s. Now, the late 90s, early 2000s, we had this whole culture of self-esteem, and that's what we're seeing reflected in the comics, these SJW comics. We're seeing characters who don't take on minimal conflict, take on minimal challenges, and whenever they run into an obstacle, it's easy to overcome because this is the life that they grew up learning. This is how they learned how to function in the real world, and this is what we're seeing reflected in a lot of the as so-called SJW comics. Moreover, we're also seeing this false sense of diversity where they give you these characters of different ethnicities, and that's all about promoting an idea of a rainbow. But this is, again, very shallow because the experiences of many of these people are very shallow. These children grew up in very shallow environments. They were enabled a lot. They were given passes for things, and they never really had the struggle. And this is reflected in the comic books that they create, the stories that they create. And what's really worse is you have seasoned writers like your Mark Wades and your Brian Michael Bendises, and they continue to further enable the SJWs and the SJW editors instead of calling it out. Now, these guys know better, but they'll sit there and give people a pass and let them go on creating this type of material. And it's really sad to see because in order to create a great comic book story has to have conflict. But these people who have grown up, these SJWs, they have never experienced conflict. They've never experienced suffering. They've never really experienced loss. They've never experienced pain. And that's what we're seeing reflected in many of their comic books is their view of the world. And their view of the world is extremely limited because they come from a very, very limited place. They're coming from a place like many of the kids that my family member sees in daycare, where they live in a vacuum. And that's why we see comics that are literally like an echo chamber, because these kids grow up in echo chambers. And in these echo chambers, they're enabled by teachers, they're enabled by daycare workers, and they're always told that they're good, they can't do anything wrong, they can't fail. And that's what leads to them going out here and creating art and literature which reflects their view of the culture. When you look at these SJW comics, they are disturbingly a reflection of the times, and they show us how deeply broken the American family truly is, because originally the comic book, again, came from people who came from two-parent households. They had fathers in the home. They had people who worked reasonable schedules where they worked 8-hour days, and then they came home, spent 8 hours with their kids, and then the family went out and did things together like go on vacations. They went out to go to places like parks and restaurants. And from those experiences, kids got a very balanced view of the world. But if we look at today's world, everything is in complete imbalance. And because everything is in complete imbalance, we have kids who are shuttled off to daycare, warehoused, then taken to public school, then taken to after-school activities, and inside of those places like daycare centers, public schools, and after-school programs, it becomes like an echo chamber because these kids, again, they grow up in an environment where they are enabled and they don't have to actually go out in the world and experience real conflict. A lot of these kids never had to grow up dealing with things like rejection. They never had to deal with things like real failure. They never have to deal with any sort of real loss. And they never really had to travel outside of a certain set of parameters. So they never really went out like kids of my day would do, go out and explore a certain part of the neighborhood or go out and explore certain things or have family members take you out to certain places. Like my brother used to take me out to Coney Island, or my father would take me to Harlem, and I would get to experience that neighborhood and experience the people of that neighborhood, or go out to different places like museums and places like that. Because in this age, we have sheltered kids so much because we're so afraid of them getting hurt that we actually don't see how we're actually hindering and impeding their growth. And we see how the impeding of their growth has been impacted in many of these SJW comic books, because this is the type of art and literature they're creating, and the art and the literature they're creating is reflective of their view of the world. And their view of the world, it's really troubling to many old school comic book fans because we're used to comic books where heroes have to overcome obstacles, heroes have to overcome conflicts, heroes have to overcome challenges. And when you take a look at some of these comics that are coming from SJW creators, they're coming from a place where these people have never really faced a challenge, they've never really faced a conflict, because their world is Starbucks coffee, sippy cups, and a complete vacuum. And because it's a complete vacuum, they can't craft stories that show us a rich, multidimensional experience because they come from a place of a limited experience. And this is why these comics, these SJW comics, are just so terrible because none of these writers, none of these artists really are coming from a place that Stan Lee came from Jack Kirby came from, or even a writer like myself comes from, because a writer like myself, I come from a very rich and broad experience. I have had different life experiences that have impacted many of the stories I write and many of the stories I tell and share with people, even in these videos. And that's what I'm sharing with people because that's my experience. And that's what you're seeing reflected in my art and literature. But in these kids' literature, you're not seeing it because a lot of these people, again, they come from very sheltered places. They come from very singular views of the world, and they're not really they haven't not learned concepts like objectivity. They've come from places, these sheltered environments like colleges, universities, publics, but they have not had much experience with the world. When you go out into the world and you experience the world, then you can start telling richer and broader stories and more complex stories. And with those type of stories, you can reach and connect with people. When it comes down to SJW comics, they don't really reach and resonate with people because most of the people who are writing and designing these stories, again, they're grossly unqualified because, yeah, they have a resume that says, I went to this university or I published this book. But again, they're coming from very limited experience, very limited life experience, and that's why their stories really don't make it where they connect with you and make you identify with their characters or identify with their experiences. Yes, they come from different ethnicities and different cultures, but the culture that's presenting, again, comes from a very limited place. And because it comes from a limited place, readers all over the world really cannot connect with their material. And that's why comics have been in a steep decline with these SJW comics, because people who come from the SJW perspective, or many of them are Gen Ys, Millennials, and Gen Zs, and their world, again, is completely different from the world of a Gen Xer or a baby boomer, a person who had to go out and survive in the world and had to go out and have experiences that shaped them, that led to their view of the world, because they had a world where we had to go outside, we had to socialize, and that was all part of our growing up process. And it was something I had talked about in a video talking about the goth generation gap, and I'm starting to see more of a generation gap as related to comics as well. And when you look at kids of today, they are raised very sheltered. They don't have to go out to do things. They can literally take an iPad and order food. They talk to people online. So they don't know how comic books work, because comic books work from an age where people had to go out and have actual interactions with people, actual conflicts, and they actually had to solve problems on the fly. And that's what people of Gen X and baby boomers had to do, because their world was about interacting with people. Whereas with these SJWs, their world is about interacting with computers or interacting in echo chambers like daycare centers, like public schools, like universities, where all you have to do is listen to one person's opinion, which is a teacher or a professor, and you don't have to deal with people who have differing opinions or different views. Now, in my day, when we went to school, we had to deal with those type of things, and it wasn't an echo chamber, and disagreement was a part of life. People had to deal with it. But these days, in public schools and in daycare centers and in colleges, it's not encouraged, and everybody's supposed to follow this monolithic thought in some places. So that's what I'm seeing reflected in a lot of these comics, and that's what I'm seeing is a lot of people with no real life experience. They're out here writing stories, and they're giving us their view of the world, and a lot of people are getting mad about it, and they're not buying the comics because they're not seeing their life experience in these stories. And I look at comics, and comics are in trouble because comics, again, they're a commentary on a period in time, and they are supposed to be a reflection of the times. And what I see with these SJW comics really is a reflection of the decline in the American family and the complete break in the American family, and how our lives have gone completely out of balance, and how this imbalance is leading to many of these unbalanced comics we're having. So in order to get great classic comics again, we're going to have to do something about the American way and the American lifestyle, because our art and our literature is a reflection of that lifestyle. And if it's broken, then it means our culture needs to be broken. And the only way for us to get a great culture again is for us to make efforts to rebalance America's lifestyle, rebalance American culture, and then we'll see more balance coming back to comic books like it was back in the 70s and the 80s. If you'd like to try some of my SJS Direct fantasy, like my ISIS series, the East-Steam series, or fantasy books like The Temptation of John Haynes or the Spinsterella Trilogy, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. And if you want to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.